Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, we sit down for a one-on-one interview with State Treasurer Mike Frerich and discuss how the state budget impasse is affecting his office's ability to make investments on the state's behalf, as well as the upcoming auction on unclaimed property at the state fair, and his calls for the governor to sign the Unclaimed Policy Bill, which would regulate the methods life insurance companies use to make payments to beneficiaries. Then in about 20 minutes from now, we head to the City Club of Chicago for a presentation by Mayor Emanuel and Alexandra Holt, the city's budget director, about the financial future of Chicago. Following that, in about 50 minutes from now, Jacob Hubert, the senior attorney for the Liberty Justice Center, discusses his organization's lawsuit challenging Illinois' Election Day voter registration. And finally, in about 1 hour from now, we run an encore presentation of an address by Jack Matlock, the former U.S. ambassador to the USSR, titled Russia Under Putin, How to Work with Him. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members.
Hi, I'm Matt Hart, Executive Director of the Illinois Trucking Association. For over 80 years, we've represented the interests of those who work in the Illinois trucking industry. We work with members of the legislature to pass laws to help make the roads safer, to help keep Illinois trucking competitive, and to help provide ongoing educational opportunities for those in our industry. The technology of trucking is forever changing. So too are the laws regulating the trucking industry. That's why the Illinois Trucking Association is proud to support the work of the Illinois Channel, which keeps citizens around Illinois connected to what's happening in state government and what changes are being discussed that will impact their families, their communities, their future. And the Illinois Channel gives those of us in industry an opportunity to share our thoughts on public policy with our fellow citizens across Illinois. I'm Matt Hart, Executive Director of the Illinois Trucking Association. I'm also proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council on Transportation. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next from Springfield, we sit down for a one-on-one interview with State Treasurer Mike Frerich and discuss how the state budget impasse is affecting his office's ability to make investments on the state's behalf, as well as the upcoming auction on unclaimed property at the state fair, and his calls for the governor to sign the Unclaimed Policy Bill, which would regulate the methods life insurance companies use to make payments to beneficiaries. This runs about 20 minutes.
State Treasurer Mike Frerich, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
Terry, glad to be back with you.
Everyone knows who's followed state government that we had a year-long budget impasse. We still don't really have a full-year budget. We have a 6-month funding bill for most state departments. You had just put out, as we sit here, a press release noting that in the second quarter the state lost, again, millions of dollars in interest.
We lost out on missed opportunities. The Treasurer's Office has never lost any money, but if we had a functioning government and had a full year budget and we could make different, longer investment decisions, we think we would have brought in an additional $7 million investments. Over the course of the year, about $31 million.
And when you are investing, first of all, just so people know, the state treasurer handles the money that's sitting in the checking account. You invest it in different financial instruments. The longer you can make a commitment, the more interest you earn. So if you have to go into really short, like 24-hour financial instruments, you get paid less interest, and that's, I guess, the nub of the problem.
Yeah, you should come work in the Treasurer's Office. You explained it very well. Everyone knows that if you have extra money and you put it in a simple savings account, you will earn less money in interest than you would if you were to put it in a CD for a longer period of time. If you can commit to a lengthier investment, you'll get a higher interest rate and you'll make more money. It's the same thing here. We don't know, we can't plan because it's uncertainty to put our investments in longer term assets. That means we bring in less money. We still make money for the state.
Right.
But
It's not that
we're
you've
missing
lost
out on opportunities to make more.
Right. So we should have made approximately, if we had had a budget and if your office could have made those longer term commitments to keep money in some instrument for 6 months or whatever, instead of a 24-hour instrument, you would have earned more interest for the people on the money that the state has sitting in their accounts.
Yeah, and specifically I want to point out in those accounts, a lot of people get confused because they say, well, we heard the general revenue fund was broke. That's just one of about 700 different accounts, funds that we oversee investments on. And most all of them have healthy fund balances. We invest about $12 billion on behalf of the state. And so just a small difference in terms of interest rate, a small improvement will generate a lot of money for the state.
You're right. In fact, we should remind people they probably hear the state budget is about $36 or $36 billion, I should say, or so. It's really combined about in the neighborhood of $60 billion because we have these, like the highway fund and any number of other funds like the LIHEAP fund where money is collected and it goes into those funds. And that's what, so you're talking about that you can invest.
Yeah, so money comes in, it builds up before we can spend it. One of those funds is the Open Space Land Acquisition Fund. And you don't buy land a square foot at a time. You have to accumulate several $1 million before you go out and actually purchase land. And so our job is to manage and invest that money until it's needed for sale.
Now that we have the 6 months funding bill, at least the state's going to continue to operate through the end of this year. Does that give you any breathing room to make any longer term decisions, or without a budget are you still having to put the money in short-term instruments?
It gives us some breathing room. We're changing our investment approach because of this, but we're not back to where we should have been over a year ago. This is an improvement over going a year without a budget, but it's not where we should be. One, it's only 6 months, it's not a full year. And two, this budget is still dramatically out of balance. I heard the governor talk repeatedly about how he needs to have a balanced budget. He's going to veto unbalanced budgets. The budget he signed, independent experts have said, is about $8 billion out of budget. This is not fiscally conservative. This is not the way to run a state.
Would you have advised that he veto that bill?
No, I would have advised putting aside non-budgetary issues. What we found is time and time again, when they just focused on budget issues, the governor and the General Assembly, they reached consensus. It's when other non-budgetary issues were brought into the fold that they found gridlock. And so I would suggest that yes, there's some other things out there that he believes would improve our state. But the lack of a budget is frequently cited by rating agencies as a reason for our credit downgrades. And not only does it hurt our ability to bring in more money, this impasse, it also makes it more expensive for the state to borrow money. When the governor has gone out twice this year to issue debt, we pay more. That's taking money out of the pockets of Illinois taxpayers. And that is directly a result of not being able to sit down and to work out a balanced year-long budget.
Right now, approximately, I mean, we're talking the general revenue funds. There's always some money in the bank. But, typically, how much money is sitting there passing through from 1 week to the next?
Well, money is always coming in. As people said to me frequently, they said, well, you work for the state, we have no money. And I said, no, we still have money. You still pay taxes. But we didn't have a spending plan in place. Now, thanks to court orders, and the governor signing an education bill last year, money has still been going out. The money comes in, and we invest, in some cases, as long as 5 years, in many cases, as short as overnight, trying to get fractions of percentage interest to bring in more money to the state.
And typically, is this, do you have like, what, $5 billion, $2 billion, or how much
so
money?
All of our combined funds, we invest this together, is about $12 billion. Okay. Depending on the time of year, we collect taxes in larger amounts at certain times of year, and certain payments go out other times of year, so it will fluctuate a little bit, but on average, that's about what we manage.
When the governor is talking, as you just alluded to, he was saying, you know, the way to really get more revenue to come in, and he's talked about being open to some more taxes. But the big money would be growing the economy again so that we're expanding faster. Do you ever touch base with either the governor or Comptroller Munger, or any, do you, as a treasurer, get to have any kind of a voice, or you ask for your voice and saying, hey, what would you think, or ideas you have to help expand the Illinois economy?
We put out our ideas, we talk to the media, we send letters. The governor has not requested my advice. The comptroller and I work fairly closely together. Our offices have to. But my advice is, if you want to grow the economy, it's good to have people with jobs. And what we found is this budget impasse has created uncertainty. Companies have not been willing to grow or relocate here. And lots of employers, not-for-profits, have been laying people off over this last year. We've lost thousands of jobs because of this uncertainty, and because, quite frankly, we're not paying our bills. You can't expect people to continue to provide services and make payroll if the state is going to welch on their promises.
Let's move on just to some other topics. Right now, as we tape this, the State Fair will be coming up in about a week. I understand you're going to have, and again, one of the duties is a little background. Your office will take possession of unclaimed property, and sometimes someone dies and there's a bank vault or
a safety deposit
box is the term I was looking for, where things are found in it and maybe no one ever claimed it, and so your office will auction off. And so tell us a little bit about this. I think you're going to be doing something a little different here at the State Fair, aren't you, relative to the unclaimed properties auction?
It'll be a little different, but this is not the first time it's been done. Judy Bartopinka, when she was treasurer, had these annual auctions at the State Fair, live auctions. They generated a lot of interest. People were excited to come to them. And we had people ask me when I came in, why don't we do that anymore? So we're going to try this again. Judy Bartopinka loved the Illinois State Fair. She had a great time there. We want other people to experience this fair, and we want people to have the excitement of a live auction. So we'll be doing that on August the 20th. This will be a live auction. If someone can't make it to Springfield, they can make arrangements to have someone bidding on their behalf.
Okay.
If they're uncertain what items will be on the auction, we've had a couple of different viewing opportunities, both in Springfield and in Chicago. And they can go to illinoistreasurer.gov and check out our resource center, and they can do an online review of things they might want to bid on.
How long would that auction last approximately, do you know?
Oh, that auction will be on August the 20th. It'll be at the Illinois State Fairgrounds at the Ethnic Village tent.
I mean, is that an hour-long auction? Will it be all day as you bring out different lots? Or do you...
It will take a little while, but it depends what kind of interest we have, how many people show up, and how fierce the bidding is. There will be many lots out there. There will be many opportunities for people if they're interested in coin collecting or in bills, in sports memorabilia, in concert tickets. There are a lot of interesting different items that someone out there valued enough to put in a safety deposit box. Unfortunately, these people probably passed away and didn't tell someone about it. So since their heirs weren't able to claim it, after several years it was turned over to us. We've been trying to locate the rightful owner for the last 5 years. So 10 years total, we've not been able to find the rightful owners. We run out of room in our vault. And so we auction this off, but we don't keep the money of the state. We are the fiduciaries, we're responsible for overseeing it, but if they or their descendants come to us tomorrow, next year, or 10 years from now, we will pay them the value that the item sold for.
And actually that was going to be what happens with that money. So do you just note that we've raised from the auctions cumulatively X number of dollars, and you kind of just keep that aside in an account in case you ever have to pay the value to people?
Yeah, we keep track of how much the item sold for. So in one case, there was someone who really valued the Air Jordans. We found a pair of size 12 Air Jordans. We've held on to them for a while. Our vault is only so big, we can only hold so many things in there, so we are auctioning that off. But if that owner or their descendants or heirs comes to us 10 years from now, we will have a record of how much those sneakers sold for, and we will give them that full amount. We don't charge anything. If anyone gets a letter from a company saying that they will help recover property that belongs to them for a fee or a percentage, it's a scam. We don't charge anyone to do this. This is my job, to get unclaimed property back into the rightful hands of their owners.
Let's look, By the way, does someone have to, they can just show up if they're at the fair, I guess, and just start, you don't really have to register beforehand or not too long beforehand.
Yeah, they can show up there, register so that we know who they are, who's bidding on this, and then just enjoy the auction. We have a professional auctioneer who's coming out. I'll try and help them out on stage a little bit, but this is going to be just like other auctions people have gone to with bidding, with paddles raised in the air. It'll be a lot of fun.
As we sit here, the other thing you just recently, a bill had passed this spring, which I think a lot of people were surprised to hear that insurance...
That a bill had passed in Springfield? A lot of people were surprised to hear that.
But in this instance, there was an insurance company, or some insurance companies were not paying off, not telling family members that we had a policy for your dad or for Uncle Louie or whomever. And sometimes people will take out life insurance policies and their family members don't know. And so if the life insurance company doesn't inform the family, the money was just sitting there.
It was sitting there, the life insurance company was investing it, and they were keeping that interest.
And this could account, I don't even know if we know how much, but it could be millions of dollars.
We have an idea, because there are over 20 companies that for the last 4 years have allowed us to come in to their company, look at their books. We compare their list of policyholders against the Social Security Administration's death master file. And if you see someone who's ended up on a death master file, there's a very good chance that that person is now dead and their beneficiaries are owed some money. Now, these 20-some companies have let us in, look at their books, and we've identified over $500 million in unpaid life insurance benefits for people in the state of Illinois. Nationwide, that number is over $7 billion. $550 million has gone directly to the heirs or come to us, and we're reuniting heirs with money that belongs to them. Now, that's not all the life insurance companies out there. We think there are hundreds of millions of dollars more that belong to people in the state, and we're fighting to get it into their hands.
And that law, or it's the bill that passed, but as we sit here, as yet the governor hasn't signed it into law, would require what?
Well, so it would require what other companies are voluntarily doing. We send our auditors in to look and see if people are owed these benefits. Right now, some of those companies say, well, actually, some of them are suing me because they don't want to open their books. They know that some of their policyholders are dead, but they maintain, how can we know? If a beneficiary doesn't contact us and give us a death certificate, how are we supposed to know if someone's dead? Well, there is a way. Under the law that we've pushed through and are waiting for the governor to sign, they will have to check their list of policyholders against the death master file twice a year. And if they find someone's on a death master file, they have to make a good faith effort to notify their beneficiaries that they are the recipient of the policy. Because I think that no one writes a check to a life insurance company because they love life insurance companies. No one writes a check because they want to make an executive richer. They write those annual checks because they want to protect someone that they love. That when they're no longer here, they want to provide for them. And we want to make sure that they're provided for in a timely manner, not 30, 40, or 50 years later.
And again, on this issue, have you or your office contacted the governor's office and explained your position? And have you had any feedback? The governor has any opposition to it?
We've reached out to the governor's office. We have heard that they are reviewing the bill. I can't tell you a single person I've talked to other than an insurance executive who thinks this bill shouldn't be law. They all think that this is the right thing to do. I know it's the right thing. That's why we've been fighting so hard for this. But I know that the insurance industry is very powerful, and I know they would like to see it stopped, and so we continue to push.
Just out of curiosity, what does an insurance executive tell you is the reason that they would be opposed to this?
Well, they say their contracts say that they don't have to pay until someone comes to them. But as you said, there are sometimes people who aren't aware they're the beneficiaries, especially in the case of small children. Sometimes parents pass away in an untimely manner, but they wanted to take care of their kids, but their kids don't know about these life insurance policies. They don't know how to go about getting a death certificate and informing a life insurance company. In those cases, those children should be taken care of in a timely manner. We've identified cases. I have called individuals who were orphaned and didn't know their parents had life insurance policies. We eventually now have reunited them with money. But those life insurance companies held on to that interest. And that is wrong. And we know that there are other people out there that this affects, and that's why we're fighting so hard for this bill.
And one last thing on this, as a precaution, everyone, if you have a life insurance policy, ought to inform someone in the family that you have it. Yeah. And make some arrangements that would be, should you come about suddenly and through an accident or something, that other people would know of this.
So hopefully they do that. Hopefully this bill becomes law and they don't have to worry so much about that. But sometimes you will list multiple beneficiaries. And sometimes, people have held on to life insurance policy for 10 years. Their beneficiary has died. And maybe they didn't notify a second beneficiary.
Before we close out, let's just talk in this interesting election year. Were you in attendance at the Democratic convention?
I was. I was in Philadelphia for 4 days of the convention.
And whatever you think of Hillary Clinton, it was at least historic, the first woman. What are your thoughts? What kind of a time did you have? And what were your impressions of the convention?
I was very excited. And I thought Michelle Obama summed it up very well on the first night. I think she gave a great speech. She talked about what this means to her daughters. I'm a father of a 7-year-old daughter, and I've had conversations with her about presidents. And I've got this plate that someone gave me. It's a historic plate from LBJ's time. It has pictures of every president around the edge of the plate. And my daughter pointed out there are no girls on there. That means something. When she's looking and thinking of what she can or can't do in her life, she looks and says, well, that's not an option for me. Now, I don't really want my daughter to go into politics. I doubt she wants to become president, but I want her to do whatever she wants to do and realize that there are no limits, there are no limitations to her potential. And so it was historic, and I think it's going to send a message to half of the people in this country that now anyone, really anyone, can be president of the United States.
And what about the future for Mark Frerich? Have you decided if you're going to run for re-election or anything else?
I just started this job about 1.5 years ago, and I'm loving it. We're doing things to lower the fees that parents are paying for their college savings accounts. We're going to make it easier for people to save for their retirement. We're going to make it easier for parents with children with disabilities to leave their kids a better life. And we're doing things like fighting powerful insurance companies to make sure that some of those vulnerable people here in the state, those who are grieving loved ones, get paid in a timely manner. This is a great job, and I can see it doing it for a while.
One thing maybe I should have asked earlier on, there's been this discussion over the years of combining the Treasurer's and Comptroller's office. Is that going to happen? Should it happen, in your estimation?
It won't happen this cycle. I said this is something I think we could do, but instead of pushing for combining these offices, the governor said he supported it before, it was then pushing for other constitutional amendments. It's a question of priorities, and it just wasn't made a priority this year. I think we could do it. I think we could save some money, but it's going to take a constitutional amendment, and it requires the General Assembly to put that on the ballot.
All right. Well, Mike Frerich, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Terry, thank you very much. Good to talk with you again.
Thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.
Hi, I'm Linda Brookhart, Executive Director of the State Universities Annuitants Association. Founded in 1971, the State Universities Annuitants Association is the only advocacy organization focusing solely on pension and health care benefits for the participants and beneficiaries within the state university's retirement system. We advocate for both active workers as well as retirees. The number of individuals are well over 200,000. As an association, we work hard to keep our members informed of possible changes in the law that may impact their pensions, their health care, and their general well-being. There is no other association working to keep individuals informed on issues that matter. This is the one reason we're also proud to support the work of the Illinois Channel. Its focus is to keep all Illinoisans informed of the issues that affect them, whether in state government or of significant changes in the private sector. The Illinois Channel's in-depth, unedited coverage of legislative events, policy discussions, interviews with lawmakers, university presidents, and business leaders keep you informed on the issues that affect your life and the future of Illinois. I'm Linda Brookhart with the State Universities Annuitants Association. I watch the Illinois Channel, and I hope you do too. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next, from Chicago, we head to the City Club of Chicago for a presentation by Mayor Emanuel and Alexandra Holt, the city's budget director, about the financial future of Chicago. This runs about 30 minutes.
So we found the 200 people that are riveted by budget, city finances, right here. Thank you. We're going to keep you guys locked up in a room. Thank you, Jay, for the introduction, and also for allowing Covenant House to also have a few moments, and look forward to their opening their doors and helping us meet an obligation we have as a city to make sure, like our veterans, nobody will call Lower Wacker home. We got to make sure our kids also have not only a roof over their heads, but all the services that are needed to help them get on the right track in their life. This is a fitting time to introduce Alex Holt, the city's budget director. I say that because a lot of times we always think of the fiscal issues or the financial issues that look at the city as the economic toolbox. And that's not how we look at it. It's a tool in our toolbox of creating jobs and economic growth, but it is not the toolbox. And I say that because this morning IBM came out with a report, and 2 years running, Chicago's the #1 city for direct foreign investment, which helps. It is also the only city in North America on the top 20 cities worldwide, and it has more direct foreign investment than Miami, Montreal, and Atlanta combined. So it's a significant statement about the confidence people have in the city and its economic future, and the best way to solve the problems we're going to talk about, or the challenges we're going to talk about, which are different today than when we were back in 2011 and 2012, is the idea of growing the economy, creating jobs and economic opportunity, because that is a significant contributor to a way to address the financial challenges. Now, overall economics, I believe in what I call the 4 T's: talent, transportation, technology, and transparency. And if you make investments in your skilled and educated workforce, in your transportation system, in the availability and capacity of your technology, and in the certainty that comes with government, the private sector is going to have the confidence to invest in a city that's not only going to look at its future, but shape its future. And you go back 5 years ago, Chicago has tremendous strengths to its economic portfolio. As I said, just take the education. 35% of the people in the city of Chicago have a 4-year college degree or better. In the United States, it's 27%. We have more institutions of higher learning than any other city in the United States, but Boston. More people, right about this time of year, not only from our institutions of higher learning, but from the University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin, from Notre Dame, come and start their career when they graduate here in the city of Chicago. I mean, I often say, around this time of year, between Madison, Wisconsin, and Chicago, do not get on the highway, you'll be roadkill. That's also true about Ann Arbor. It's true about South Bend. And that skilled and educated workforce, an aviation system that's unparalleled in the United States, keeps Chicago at the top of its game. But if you go back to 2011, the biggest thing that was a dark cloud over the future of the city's economy was our fiscal picture. And that tool in the toolbox was actually hurting all the other elements of our city. And we worked systematically to the point, and I don't know if you saw this on Friday, but as Alex's office reported, the structural or operating deficit for the city of Chicago today is the smallest it's been in nearly a decade, reduced by 80% since the day we took office. A far different picture, and Alex and the whole economic team rejected those who, coming out of the recession, said what you should do, raise taxes, as if there was no reform to be done. Also those who then, on the other side of the table, who advocated just cut government without regard that people in different communities are affected by government in different ways. And through going literally line by line, asking tough questions both on the revenue side as well as on the operating side, making fundamental changes. Today, we have the smallest operating annual deficit in nearly a decade, reduced by 80%, and for the first time, you can actually see the other side of the riverbank and make it towards that riverbank. And 3 of the 4 pensions that were also not in good shape now have not only a funding source, they're on a 40-year arc to making sure that our commitment to the people, whether they're police officers, firefighters, or laborers, can be met. And the fiscal picture of the city of Chicago, while not done, is much stronger. And a glaring, or in my view, powerful example of all the work that Alex and the team have done is the fact that take today our healthcare costs, our healthcare budget is flat to where it was when we took office, or our first budget in 2012. And I would challenge anybody here, from the public sector or the private sector, that could look back at your healthcare costs over the last 5 years and call them flat, the healthcare budget as flat. So that, to me, is an example of what Alex has done and her team. Now, about this time, we start our planning for the next budget. And we sit at the conference table. And I always like to, don't get so silent, it's not that great a story, guys. In about August, Alex starts in a gray outfit. And as we get closer and closer to that budget, it becomes all black. And I like to always joke with her and tease with her. I said, oh, this looks like it's going to be a great day today, Alex. So she has done, and never, I will also say to all of you, the city's finances has never been in better shape since Aaron, Alex, and Carol are both the make up the financial team of the city of Chicago. It's all in women's hands, so we're in great hands. That's first time ever for the city. Now that said, I do want to say I can't say enough about Alex Holt. She has been a committed public servant. It is not easy, both getting 3 or 4 pensions right, literally reducing the annual deficit by 80%, being a very dedicated public servant who has gone through the budget line by line. What can we sustain that allows us to both reform the fiscal picture without upsetting the economic growth strategy? And her commitment to what she does, her commitment to her colleagues and the folks that work in the budget office, and her commitment to making the changes necessary for the long-term financial and economic sustainability of the city of Chicago. We, as citizens of the city of Chicago, are well served by her spirit and commitment to the future of this city. Ladies and gentlemen, Alex Holt.
Okay, so maybe y'all don't need me anymore. I think I could go, right? Thank you, Mayor. Much appreciated. And I also want to really say thank you to the City Club for allowing me to be here today to talk to you about the city's finances. You know, we went back and looked, and I was last here just over 4 years ago. And when I came to address the City Club last time, it wasn't such a rosy picture. The city's finances were in a very different place than they are today. We had a structural deficit that was over $600 million. We had one-time revenues that were being used to fill the hole, and they were masking the true cost of government. In addition, scoop and toss and the city's other debt management practices were adding more and more expense to the city's credit card every year. And then, as the mayor mentioned, in 2011, there was not a sustainable funding or benefit reform plan for any of the city's 4 pensions. And as I talked about at that point in time, we had a lot of hard work ahead of us, a lot of difficult decisions, but all of that was going to be necessary to address the legacy financial liabilities that the city was facing and to make fundamental changes to the way the city managed its finances. And all of this was critical to Chicago and critical to all of the things, the economic growth and the other things that the mayor mentioned. But today, in contrast, I get to come back to you guys and actually talk about some fun stuff. And some serious progress that we've made over the last number of years. Now, you note fun, that's the budget office's version of fun, right? I'm not sure any of you all might think it's fun, but any case. So we're now in a position where the structural deficit has been decreased by over 75%. And we are looking forward to the time in the next couple of years when balancing the city's budget is not about the structural deficit. It's about only balancing towards our normal cost growth, the year-over-year growth that we expect to have. One-time revenues are no longer used to fill the hole and to pay our bills. And on top of that, we've reformed our debt management practices, and scoop and toss is going to be phased out by 2019. And then finally, and I think in some ways one of the most important factors, is the fact that 3 of our 4 pension funds now have a balanced funding solution, and we're in the process of working on a solution for the 4th and final pension fund. So, when we think about all of that, we think about the fact that in every facet of the city's finances, we are much better off today than we were 5 years ago. When we think about the hard work and the difficult decisions that have been made over the course of the last 5 years, all of that really does become evident in the city's annual financial analysis, which we issued last Friday. So the annual financial analysis is a document that the Budget Office puts out every year. It presents a holistic picture of the city's finances. It projects the gap for the coming year, and it really is, for us, the start of the budget process. And for those of y'all who have a bad case of insomnia, it's great bedtime reading. Although, again, being the Budget Office, I actually think it's kind of entertaining and interesting. But again, we'll move on. When we think about that, when the annual financial analysis for 2017, we're facing a shortfall of $137.6 million. That is significantly smaller than it has been in a very long period of time. The lowest it's been since 2007. When the and lower, certainly much lower than it was in 2011, when we projected when the city had an operating deficit of $654 million. And I think you can see from the slide up there the progress that we've made over the course of the last 5 years. And as I said before, this is a 75% reduction in a 5-year time period. Now, we've achieved this reduction through savings across government, revenue growth from the city's strong economic performance, and some new revenue sources as well. While revenues have been part of the picture, savings and efficiencies have been the place that we've gone first. And in fact, when you look at all the actions that we've taken over the last 5 years, there's been $640 million worth of savings and efficiencies across government since 2011. Some examples of that include 2,600 position vacancies that we've cut for a savings of almost $200 million. We've put into place apprenticeship programs, competitive bidding, work rule changes, and other collaborative agreements with our friends in labor. That's resulted in $50 million worth of savings. We have energy savings from energy efficiency and smart energy purchasing that's produced $20 million worth of savings. As the mayor mentioned, our healthcare costs have been stable since 2012, and that's from the result of the phase out of retiree healthcare. We've had benefit reforms and healthcare cost controls that have been put into place. There's almost $100 million worth of savings within our healthcare costs alone. We've changed the way that the city delivers certain services. For example, we've put garbage on a grid. You wouldn't think that was revolutionary, but it was made a big change in the city of Chicago. From those kinds of service changes, there are $25 million worth of savings. And then finally, we've scrutinized every line. We've looked at cell phones, we've looked at copiers, we've looked at office supplies, we've looked at duplicative services across departments, we've looked at duplicative actions within departments. All of that together has resulted in another $50 million worth of savings. And while the focus has been on savings and reforms, sustainable and targeted revenue growth has definitely been part of the package. We've looked to eliminate outdated tax exemptions, such as the amusement tax exemption on luxury skyboxes. So apologies to any of y'all with a luxury skybox. We've also worked to close tax loopholes, and we've looked to level the playing field between traditional services and new economy services. For example, imposing the hotel tax on Airbnb vacation rentals. The other factor, not only has it been the new taxes or the new revenue sources, it's also been the growth in Chicago's economy. Our revenues continue to benefit from our strong economy, and key economically sensitive tax revenues have been increasing year over year over the last 5 years. Sales tax, personal property lease tax, hotel tax, amusement tax, income tax. All of those have seen regular growth over the years. That's directly the result of Chicago's economy and the growth and the strength of our economy. Now, we are projecting a decline in our 2017 revenues. However, that's really due to some actions the state has taken and not about the fundamentals of Chicago. In fact, when I look at 2017, those key and those economically sensitive revenue sources are projected to grow. Sales tax is projected to be up 3% over the 2016 year end. Personal property lease tax is expected to be up 4.5% over the already strong growth we've seen in 2016. And our real property transfer tax is expected to be up another 4% over the 2016 budget. Really, by combining not just the growth, but our savings, our efficiencies, our service reforms, and the sustainable revenue growth that I've been talking about, we've managed to close our operating gap each year. But I think the thing about it is you have to keep in mind that we've done that while doing three other things. First, we've eliminated our reliance on one-time revenues. Those revenues that had historically balanced the budget, which were primarily from the sale or the concessions of certain city assets, such as the parking meters. We've eliminated that. In 2011, as you can see here, there was almost $570 million worth of one-time revenues that went into paying our basic bills. By 2016, that number is $40 million. That's 1% of our operating budget. And that comes primarily from things like TIF surplus. And it's an amount of money that I would expect to see in a budget of our size on an annual basis that would be one-time revenue on an annual basis. The other thing is that we've actually been phasing out the use of bonds for certain operating expenses. The city has a long history of using long-term borrowing for short-term expenses, retroactive salary payments, library books, trees, fountain maintenance, the list goes on. Over the last 3 years, we have used more than $200 million worth of operating dollars to pay for those kinds of expenses, moving them off of long-term borrowing and putting them into the city's operating budget and continuing the path of having sustainable finances. And then I think finally, the third factor, which really is probably the most important one, is that we have balanced the budget and reduced the structural deficit while adding resources. We're adding resources in basic services, citywide recycling, tree trimming, pothole filling crews. And we've also added resources to things that invest in our services that invest in our communities, such as increasing the amount of money available for early childhood education, or after-school programming, or summer jobs. For 2017, our approach will be very much the same as it has been for the last 5 years. It's going to be about aligning expenses and revenues, looking for those opportunities to cut, and looking for targeted revenue sources, while at the same time maintaining and enhancing those core and critical services to our neighborhoods. So when we think about the city's legacy financial liabilities, I tend to think about them in three buckets. We think about the structural deficit, which I just discussed. We think about the city's debt and debt management practices, and we also think about pensions. But we've also been making progress on all of them, and we've particularly been making progress on the second of these legacy liabilities, the city's debt and debt management practices. In the spring of 2015, the mayor announced a roadmap to end unsustainable financial practices of the past and to eliminate hundreds of millions of dollars of risk to taxpayers. And we've delivered already on the first of those commitments that he made, which is to convert, and we have done that by converting all of the city's taxpayer-funded variable rate debt to fixed rate debt and terminating the swaps associated with them. Another critical component of the mayor's roadmap was the phase out and a pure total elimination of scoop and toss. For those of you all who don't know, I'm guessing most people in the room do, but for those of you all who don't know, scoop and toss is a practice whereby the city borrows money to make current debt payments. It's really akin to borrowing money to make your mortgage payments. Practice that needs to end, and a practice that we are committed to phasing out by 2019. In 2016, we took the first step towards phasing out scoop and toss, and that first step in budgeting enough money to pay our debt instead of borrowing to make our debt payments. The 2016 budget decreases scoop and toss by $100 million. And by 2019, we will include another $300 million in our budget, enough to make all of our debt payments, and we will no longer borrow to pay the mortgage. But our focus hasn't only been, thanks to Carol. So our focus hasn't only been on ending these risky and unsustainable financial practices. We've also been working to identify real and sustainable plan to address the city's 4 pension funds. In 2011, we faced sizable unfunded pension liabilities, and all 4 of our pension funds were on a path to insolvency somewhere between the next 5 and 15 years. Today, we have permanent recurring revenue sources for our police, fire, and laborers' pension funds that put them on a track toward solvency. Last fall, we adopted a 4-year, $540 million property tax increase dedicated to police and fire pensions. The property tax increase is based on a funding plan which doubles the city's payments in 1 year and nearly triples them over a 3-year time period. And then, beginning in 2020, the city moves to an actuarially funded payment structure for police and fire. And then these funds will be 90% funded by 2055. Now, turning to laborers and the laborers fund and the municipal fund, as you all might have heard, we had a little bit of a stumble there. Earlier this year, the Illinois Supreme Court struck down Senate Bill 1922. And Senate Bill 1922 was a piece of legislation that, for the first time, put the municipal and laborers fund required that the contributions from the city for the municipal and laborers fund were on an actuarially funded basis. It also included benefit reforms for employees and retirees so that residents and taxpayers didn't have to bear the full burden themselves. With the Illinois Supreme Court ruling on 1922, the funding guarantees went away, along with the benefit reforms, and it put these funds back on a path for insolvency. But our approach wasn't to sit around and wait to see what happens. We actually started working on a new solution immediately with our partners in labor. And as a result, in May of 2016, the city announced an agreement in principle on funding and benefit reforms for the laborers' pension fund. The city will commit to increasing our payments over the next 5 years, and then in 2022, we're committing to go to contributions that are actuarially based. New hires, starting January 1, 2017, will pay 3% more towards their pensions, and assuring that the taxpayers do not have to bear the full burden in the future. People who were hired on January 1, 2011 have the option to pay 3% more and retire with their full pension benefits at age 65 instead of age 67. And then finally, the laborers fund will be 90% by 2057. To make these increased contributions, the city has dedicated the additional corporate fund revenue that is available from the increase of the 911 surcharge. And then, in fact, later this year, we're going to the General Assembly to ask for approval of this collaborative agreement. Now, similar to the shared path forward for laborers, we're working on a solution for the municipal fund, and a solution that we hope mirrors the plan that we've put forward for laborers. And we anticipate being able to announce a solution and a funding and benefit solution to the municipal fund in the coming weeks. The work that we've undertaken in the last 5 years, really to strengthen both our short-term and long-term financial health, has really impacted our ability to provide core city services. But it really does more than that. As the mayor talked about, it does much more than that. Stable finances allow the Chicago's economy to continue to grow and to flourish, and they ensure that we're able to invest in things like after-school programs, repairing bridges, bike lanes, and helping to provide safer neighborhoods across the city. With each year, we've not only changed the trajectory of the current operating shortfall, but we've also made significant progress to close the gap in future years. In fact, in 2014, we projected that the city's 2017 budget operating shortfall would be nearly $600 million without fundamental changes to our finances and fundamental changes to the way we do business. Today, we're solving for a $137.6 million gap. Now, I'm not here to say that all of our work's done and that our financial challenges are all solved. But I do think it bears repeating, and it is true, that in every facet of the city's finances, from our pensions to our debt to our operating budget, that we're definitely heading in the right track. Thank you.
What strategies does the City of Chicago undertake to avoid the tax volatility of the energy market, specifically focusing on utility budgets? Always good to start off with an easy question. Very good.
I guess this is the time when I can refer to some of my colleagues in the room and make them answer the questions. No, in all seriousness, the volatility of energy prices impacts the city in two ways. It impacts our revenue from utility taxes, but it also impacts us as a user of utility services. With respect to the utility taxes and the revenue that we get, I think probably referring to what's been happening to natural gas prices, and we have a gross receipts tax on natural gas, and so we've seen a lot of volatility, and the really kind of wacky weather hasn't helped us much either. We approach that by looking over years and trying to smooth out our revenue projections over a course of years so that we don't have any year which is particularly up or any year which is particularly down. With respect to the cost side of the structure, the Department of Fleet and Facility Management, headed by David Reynolds and his team, have done an enormous amount of work to look at both energy efficiency, but also fuel hedging and energy hedging. All of that leads to stability in our prices. It doesn't mean that we're, totally immune from the same impacts that other people have and that businesses have, but that we try to take the same strategies to mitigate any of those cost impacts.
Assuming a $9 billion Chicago City budget, how much more would the budget need to be to make meaningful contribution to the underfunded pension plans? You kind of answered that, but
a lot.
A lot.
No. And it's $9.6 billion, in case you wanted to know. That's really the issue that we've had around the unfunded liability for our pension funds, which is that we know there's significant unfunded liability there. We need to increase our payments. We need to be putting more towards these pension funds. But we want to do it in a way which is manageable for our taxpayers. We can't be in a situation where we're going to have a $550 or $600 million increase in our payments overnight. That has to come from someplace. It has to either come from increased taxes and revenues, or it has to come from service cuts. And so our approach has been to look at a sustainable plan, in particular for the three funds for which we have identified a stable and recurring revenue source. We're ramping up our payments over a 5-year period and then moving to actuarial funding, at which point the amounts of money that we're going to need each year are going to be manageable and should be something that we can manage within the context of our budget.
What are the city's plans relative to addressing violent crime in the city? Obviously right up your alley. Are more policemen part of the built into the financial plan? There you go.
I don't think I see the police superintendent anywhere here, because otherwise I would definitely punt this question. It is, as you noted, a little bit out of my bailiwick. The thing that I think about in the work that the budget office does and the team in the budget office does is to think about how we support departments and what they need. They and the mayor have to make the policy decisions about what's necessary to achieve, increased safety in our communities, or how do we want to deal with and support people who are homeless in the city. What do we want to do about, bike lanes and potholes and tree trimming and all of those things. It's our job to go and look for all the opportunities to save money, all the opportunities to find efficiencies, and to do that within the context of knowing that there are going to be additional resources that are needed for a variety of services and for a variety of activities. One thing we did in the police department this year was the police department went through and identified every police officer who was in a job that didn't require a badge and a gun. If they didn't require a badge and a gun, then we put into place a civilian position to take that duty, to send that police officer back on the street. And that's been part of our ongoing process throughout the city, but particularly within the police department, to make sure that the resources that they have and the police officers that they have are doing the job that they're supposed to be doing, which is protecting our city.
You have described the strengths and opportunities from a financial perspective. Congratulations. That's from Ed Mather. Now, the sandbag. What are the potential weaknesses and threats to this stability? Last question. You could take a mulligan if you like.
I get to say none. I think there are weaknesses and are issues, I should say, in every budget and in any government's finances, particularly when you have revenues that can be that are economically sensitive and vary with the economy. And there are also issues with respect to cost. I mean, the same kinds of cost impacts that a private business or somebody else might affect. We talked about utility taxes earlier. Fuel prices are also another big one for us. There are all of those things that go into the process each year, and that as we look through, we have to find a way to essentially hedge those risks. We have to find a way to build a cushion, and to build that cushion for the time when the revenues maybe aren't as strong as they have been, or we have an unexpected expense. And that's actually been one of the activities that we've been undertaking as well, is building up that fund balance, having those revenues available, so to the extent that we face something unexpected, we're in a good position to manage it.
Very good. Give a round of applause. Parting gift.
Just ahead, Jacob Hubert, the senior attorney for the Liberty Justice Center, discusses his organization's lawsuit challenging Illinois' Election Day voter registration. This runs about 10 minutes.
Good morning. My name is Jacob Hubert, and I'm senior attorney at the Liberty Justice Center. This morning we filed a lawsuit in federal court challenging Illinois' system of Election Day voter registration. In 2014, Illinois legislators passed a law creating a system of Election Day voter registration in Illinois. The system they created is not fair because it doesn't give everyone in Illinois an equal opportunity to register and vote on Election Day. The law requires Illinois' 20 counties with a population of 100,000 or more to allow people to register and vote at their local precinct polling places on Election Day. But the law does not require Illinois' 82 counties with a population under 100,000 to allow people to vote at their local polling places on Election Day. As a result, most of those low population counties are not going to offer Election Day registration at their polling places. It's costly and difficult to implement, so if they don't have to do it, almost certainly they're not going to do it. And so because of this system, it's going to be much easier for people in higher population counties to register and vote on Election Day than it will be for people in lower population counties. That's unfair and it's unconstitutional. The state cannot give some citizens better opportunities to vote than it gives to other citizens. And this scheme isn't just unfair to voters, it's also unfair to the candidates who depend on support from voters in lower population counties. It's hard to believe that's an accident. The General Assembly passed this scheme on strict party lines shortly after Governor Bruce Rauner was elected to office, but before he took office. Every senator and representative who voted for this scheme was a Democrat, and every senator and representative who voted against it was a Republican. Not coincidentally, high population counties tend to favor Democratic candidates, and lower population counties tend to favor Republican candidates. So what did Democratic legislators really do when they enacted Illinois' scheme of Election Day registration? They tilted the political playing field to favor Democrats like them. They set up a scheme designed to boost voter turnout. They set up a scheme designed to boost Democratic voter turnout more than it would boost Republican voter turnout. This is just another example of how Illinois politicians rig the system to keep themselves in power. If Illinois wants to provide Election Day registration at the polling places, it can do so in a way that's fair and equal. 6 other states, including Illinois' neighbors, Wisconsin and Indiana, have enacted Election Day registration schemes that give voters statewide the opportunity to register and vote at their polling places. They don't favor voters in some counties over voters in other counties. In fact, no other state has an Election Day registration scheme that discriminates in favor of voters in some counties and against voters in other counties. One of our clients in this case is Patrick Harlan, a candidate for Congress. He's bringing this lawsuit to make sure that his supporters in lower population counties have the same opportunities to register and vote that people in higher population counties have. Our other client in this case is the Crawford County Republican Party. Crawford County has about 19,000 residents and won't be offering Election Day registration at its polling places. The Crawford County Republican Party wants to make sure that voters in Crawford County have the same opportunity to vote as people in higher population counties.
In our lawsuit, we're asking the federal court to order the Illinois State Board of Elections to direct election authorities in all 102 Illinois counties not to provide Election Day registration at polling places. That's the only way a federal court can fix the unfairness of this law. And again, the General Assembly could fix the unfairness of this law by simply making Election Day registration available at polling places everywhere, not just in places where a political party wants to boost its turnout. Thank you, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Is there a system you see for same-day registration that would get there? Why strike all of it down? Why not propose some kind of solution?
Well, to be clear, we are not advocating striking down the entire Election Day registration scheme that was enacted. We are only challenging the part that pertains to one's ability to vote at precinct polling places. In 2014, the state had a pilot Election Day registration program that allowed voters statewide to register and vote on Election Day by going to a centralized location. And that's fair, that's equal, and that's part of the new scheme as well, and we don't challenge that part of it. So in any event, voters will have an opportunity to register and vote on Election Day if they want to. But what we're challenging is just the part relating to polling places, which isn't fair because, of course, if you can go to your polling place and register and vote, that's a whole lot easier than going to some other office and doing it and voting. And to fix this scheme, what the state can do is what 6 other states have done, what Wisconsin and Iowa have done, and that is just make it available at polling places everywhere. That's right. We can't ask the federal court to make Illinois have Election Day registration at all polling places because the General Assembly hasn't authorized that. The federal court would essentially have to rewrite the law and impose an unfunded mandate on every county in Illinois, which isn't appropriate for a federal court to do. Well, I mean, the legislature can correct this. We're calling attention to the problem through this, and so if they want to correct it, they certainly can do so, and we hope they do so.
Can you elaborate a little more on the legal theory, I guess, behind your lawsuit? You mentioned that you believe it violates the 14th Amendment. Can you just elaborate a little more on that?
Sure. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment gives every qualified citizen the right to vote on an equal basis. And the Supreme Court has made clear that you can't arbitrarily discriminate against certain voters based on where they live. But that's exactly what this statute does on its face.
And can you elaborate again on the kind of relief that you're seeking from the federal court? Are you seeking to strike down this part of the law, rewrite this part of the law? I just want to clarify what kind of relief can you get from the federal court?
Well, before this election, we'll be filing a motion for preliminary injunction asking the court to direct the State Board of Elections to direct all county election authorities not to implement Election Day registration at polling places at all for this election. And then ultimately the relief would be to strike down this portion of the Election Day registration scheme, which discriminates in who can register and vote at their polling place on Election Day. It's just that portion that we would ask the court to strike down, not the rest of the Election Day registration scheme.
And why are you bringing forward this lawsuit now? I mean, it was enacted in 2014. I was just wondering, why now? Why now as opposed to, say, a month ago or even a year ago?
Well, we didn't notice it a year ago. We noticed it more recently than that. And then, of course, it takes time to put a lawsuit together. So now is when we're bringing it. Obviously, it's very urgent because the November election is just over 3 months away. And it would have been better to bring it sooner. But we're bringing it now because now is when we're prepared to bring it.
I guess conversely, you mentioned that this law would, the law as it's currently enacted benefits. It seems to benefit the Democratic Party more because this law is occurring and it's mandatory in larger counties which favor Democrats. Wouldn't by asking a preliminary injunction to halt this activity before the election, wouldn't that decrease Democratic Party turnout?
It would make the law neutral so that the law isn't playing favorites with voters in one county versus another. And then the political parties are playing on an equal playing field. So it would simply make the law neutral. And then how an election shakes out once you have neutral laws is, of course, up to the voters to decide who they're going to vote for.
And with respect to the other 80 or so counties that are currently, it's optional for them to do this. Are you aware of any counties that are actually setting up this kind of system to allow voters to register on election day at polling places?
I believe Grundy County is rushing at considerable expense to get this in place, even though they don't have to. That's the only county we're aware of that doesn't have to offer election day registration at the polls, but is going to do so anyway.
Hi, I'm Don Schaefer, Executive Vice President of Midwest Truckers Association. We represent over 2,700 member companies in 15 states who operate in Illinois. These men and women are responsible for keeping the food in your store, the fuel at your gas station, and bringing the books to your schools. In fact, look around the house and virtually everything you see will have been moved at one time or another by a truck. That's why our issues are your issues. Whether it's the taxes they pay, the price of fuel, or the regulations truckers must endure, in the end, you, the consumer, pay the price. That's one reason why I'm proud to serve on the Illinois Channel Advisory Council. Just as truckers deliver the goods on our nation's highways, the Illinois Channel delivers the information you need on your information highway. The Illinois Channel reaches 1.4 million cable homes across the state, as well as making their programming available as a video stream on their website at illinoischannel.org. Delivering the goods is Midwest Truckers' business. Delivering the information you need to stay connected to the actions of state government, that's the Illinois Channel's business. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next, from Chicago, Jack Matlock, the former U.S. ambassador to the USSR from 1987 to 1991, gives an address at the Union League Club of Chicago titled Russia Under Putin, How to Work with Him. This runs about 50 minutes.
The question before us that I was asked to talk about is Russia under Putin, how to work with it. You know, looking out at the recent developments, and particularly a lot of the rhetoric over the last 3 or 4 years, one would almost think that we're back in a Cold War. Except this time it's not a Cold War with the Soviet Union, a great communist empire, but with the Russian Federation. The rhetoric going back and forth, the condemnations back and forth, and even, I would say, the requirements that the leaders on both sides are now pressing for more military confrontation is very reminiscent of the Cold War. However, when you really think about it, the issues are quite different. After all, the Cold War was fundamentally about ideology, about the communism and the attempt of the Soviet Union, in effect, to spread communism in the world, which was sort of the original intent of the victors in the Bolshevik Revolution. And, of course, the geopolitical competition that developed from that, then the military competition, and then the absolutely insane nuclear arms race. We reached a point during that nuclear arms race when I think some calculated that each side had enough nuclear weapons, if they were used, to destroy not just each other, but civilization on Earth, and maybe, certainly humanity on Earth, not once, not twice, but 7 times over. And, you know, I would think at the time, you know, once you've done it once, why do you want to do it more than that? But, of course, the reason we gave was not how much we could destroy, but the fear that the other side, if they thought they had an advantage, might attack us. Now, we were able, actually, thinking back, over a relatively few years since in the late 80s, to end that arms race and to get the level of arms way down. In fact, at least during the Reagan administration, dealing with Gorbachev, our two leaders actually had a goal of ultimately eliminating nuclear weapons, which is a goal we need, I think, to revive. So the present confrontation is nowhere like that. But the difficulty is it could become that again, because in all of the things we've been talking about and are talking about today, differences over Ukraine, differences over Syria, what we're not talking about is the nuclear arsenals that both our countries have. And that is, you might say, the elephant in the room, which we're ignoring. Okay, thinking back, before we think about what we can do to deal with Russia under the current president, Vladimir Putin, we ought to give some thought to how we got to where we are now. There is a traditional Russian, I would say almost habit, going back to the middle of the 19th century, that when conditions are bad, you ask two questions. One is, "Kto vinovat?" Who's to blame? And the other is, "Что делать?" What are we supposed to do? What to do? And I think that, first of all, let's think about "Kto vinovat?" Who is responsible? And I would say that if you want to know what has produced the current policies that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is carrying out, which are very popular in Russia, this is something we must not forget, is something that both sides contributed to. Who is responsible for the current relationship? The United States and the Russian government. We bear mutual responsibility. Just as earlier, the end of the Cold War ended when we finally were able to cooperate with the leader of the Soviet Union toward the common end of ending the insanity of the arms race. This time, we seem to be at cross purposes in a number of areas. And I would say that, in thinking about this and who is responsible and of the actions of both, I'm reminded of a story that one of the Russian politicians in the 1990s used to say about Russian economic reform. He said it reminded him of the story of two Russian bear hunters that every year would go up in the north. They'd charter a plane, go up and hunt for bear, and so they are going up, and the charter pilot tells them, "Okay, I'll leave you here for a week. Now shoot only one bear because we don't have room for two." So the pilot comes back in a week, and they've shot two bears. And he said, "Look, I told you only one." They said, "Look, there are two bears here. Look, we'll give you a couple of $100 extra. You can get that second bear in." So he does, grumbling a bit. They take off, crash landing. Nobody's seriously injured, but they look around, and one of them says, "Where are we?" And the other said, "Well, I don't know exactly, but I think it's about where we crashed last year." And I think, as we look back at what's happened, both sides keep making the same mistakes. And what has happened, I would say, since the end of the Cold War, and when by 1992 we thought we had a Europe whole and free. That's what we talked about. And it was sincere, because we had the Warsaw Pact was down, there was peace, there were increasingly democratic governments, at least elected governments across Eastern Europe. Russia itself, in the view of the West, was democratizing, and we had what we thought had been the goal, a Europe whole and free. Well, who were the first to begin to, I would say, act inconsistent with that? The first decision was the decision on the part of the United States and its NATO allies to begin expanding NATO, leaving Russia out. Now, you can't have a Europe whole and free if Russia's not part of it. Complicated going that. Now, what was the Russian reaction to that? At first, with the first expansion to the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, this was accepted. They were disappointed a bit, but not too much reaction. But then, when over the problems in Kosovo, NATO, without UN approval, began bombing Serbia, an act of war, which under UN was illegal because Serbia had not invaded any NATO country. Suddenly, this became a big issue because we had told Russia, look, you don't have to worry. NATO is a defensive alliance. It's incapable of offensive. And suddenly, in attacking Serbia, over humanitarian reasons to be sure, but it was not defensive. So that, I think, in Russian eyes, broke a number of agreements. The Russian reaction to these various things, and as we went into the later into the second Bush administration, the Bush-Cheney administration, we had at first a very good improvement with Russia. Russia was out of their bankruptcy, which occurred in the late 90s, and I must say that as we were beginning expanding to NATO, Russia was going through a period of near chaos. It was not anything like we would consider democracy. Russia has never had democracy, and that's one thing we have to think about, and we have to be a little careful when we speak of Vladimir Putin backtracking on democracy. They haven't had it. They had something very close to anarchy in the 90s. But actually, when Putin came to power, he was able to get the Russian economy back on the upswing, helped greatly, of course, by rising oil prices, but nevertheless, his own administration was much more predictable, much more rational than Yeltsin's had been. But at the same time, even though he was the first to pledge support to the United States after 9/11, and indeed did what he could to assist our invasion of Afghanistan with rights overflight rights, and also with intelligence assistance regarding Afghanistan. Nevertheless, very quickly we withdrew from the ABM Treaty, which had been the basic treaty on which most of our arms control agreements had been. As we continued to expand NATO to the east, we then began to talk about American bases in the Balkans. We began to make plans for missile defenses in Eastern Europe, when on the very implausible ground that you would need them to defend against then non-existent Iranian missiles. Why the Iranians would ever attack Western Europe with missiles was a mystery to some of us. To most of us, it seemed that this was simply an effort of our own military-industrial complex to continue producing these things. Now, each of these things, they were taken for reasons other than to combat Russia or irritate Russia, but it got, I would say, a negative reaction from the Russians. You had something like a vibration that starts. First, it's sort of limited, and then it begins to amplify back and forth. Actions would be taken in the West and particularly by the United States, that were interpreted to the Russians as being hostile and building up a cordon sanitaire around Russia to bring pressure to bear on it. As I said, that was probably not the intent of most of the people involved, but nevertheless, that's the way it was read. So what you had was a gradually deteriorating relationship made particularly acute when we officially began to interfere more and more in the Russian political process itself. Now, it's one thing to say, we need to spread democracy in the world. I think that for reasons that I don't have time to explain, I don't think that is a great idea. It reminds me of the attempt of the Soviet Union to spread communism in the world, or what they call socialism, particularly when you're doing it by force, because I don't think outsiders can create democracy for other people. But in any event, the Russians would interpret this as the official American support for the opposition. Now, how does any country, particularly the United States and Americans, react to a foreign country interfering in their domestic affairs? Usually it's to the detriment, almost always, of the person supported. Now, actually, although we ostensibly were trying to help the so-called Democrats, and they were philosophically Democrats, in Russia we were actually hindering them by making them seem as if they were disloyal, seem just the way we would consider communists during the Cold War. Even if they were only philosophically communists and not spies and so on, nevertheless, they must be enemies. So that combination of what the Russian perceives as interference in their internal affairs, plus what they saw as an effort to penetrate and turn against Russia, former republics of the Soviet Union, again, drew very, very negative reactions in Russia. And this was particularly true when you get to Ukraine and Georgia. As far as the three Baltic countries were concerned, I think the Russians were reconciled the fact that they had been a great history in the West. They had been independent, before World War II. They were reluctantly going to accept that they were independent and really part of the West. But what they didn't like was what seemed to be an effort to turn Ukraine, to turn Georgia, even to penetrate militarily into what had been Soviet Central Asia. So these so-called color revolutions, which were genuine revolutions in those countries because they were real abuses, nevertheless, the overt involvement of our own people in them conveyed to the Russians that they were simply tools, you might say, of an American imperialist instinct. So you got what Russians considered provocations. In many cases, what the U.S. was doing was using, I would say, they were following an entirely different philosophy. As a matter of fact, when we look at our current problems, we can see that there really are two, I would say, faulty narratives going on behind our current problems with Russia. The narrative in the West is that we are operating to spread democracy, we are defending the civilized world against terrorism, and are spreading democracy for the good of all the people, and that we are, as the sole superpower, it is our responsibility, in effect, to be the world's policeman and also the world's judge, and, if necessary, the world's executioner. You know, that really isn't acceptable to Russia. And a lot of this, of course, is based on a misinterpretation of the Cold War. We negotiated an end to the Cold War with Gorbachev, and it was a victory for both sides because it was in the interest of a Soviet Union willing to be peaceful. The Soviet Union came down later, not at the end of the Cold War, but after it was over because of internal pressures. However, when we started talking about we won the Cold War, and implicitly you were defeated in the Cold War, you're not a world power anymore, you're just a regional power. As if the amount of power somehow was correlated with virtue or goodwill or other things. And so much of our policy and our action to the Russians seems to be putting them down, treating them as if they were defeated. On the Russian side, they saw all of this increasingly as an attempt to put them down, an attempt to isolate them from the world, and a refusal to consider their interests in the world whatsoever. So you had this back and forth escalating in terms of tension. Now, okay, what are we going to do about it? How do we get it on? Now, first of all, I think it is to recognize the process that we have gone through and the fact that we are forgetting that fundamentally the most fundamental interests of the United States and the most fundamental interests of Russia do not conflict. It was really that understanding on which we ended the Cold War. I don't have time to go into detail and precisely how we did it, but essentially we tried to define our ends, that is, the goals we were trying to seek, and find ways to cooperate to reach those goals. And when we think about the large problems facing the world today in the security area, terrorism, even more important in the security area, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and the prevention of the nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction from getting in the hands of terrorists. The global warming, an enormous problem for the future if we're not able to cooperate. The spread of disease, it's hardly another month that another one doesn't come up that we're having to work on trying to contain. Just as you seem to have contained Ebola, others come forward as we're seeing today. These require international efforts, and none of these big problems are going to be solvable without the cooperation of Russia. It's just simply too big. It doesn't have the population it used to have, but it is still a great power in many ways. And when, in their eyes, you put them down, as the president has, when he said, oh, they're only a global power. Now, he was trying to refute ideas that they are, a great threat to us. But the point is, I would say, any country with several thousand ICBMs that could hit us if fired in just a few minutes is not a global power. It's not simply a regional power. Any country that now has the only boosters that can take people to the International Space Station, because we don't have any we're using now, we're using Russian ones, is not simply a regional power. And okay, so they are a regional power. Shouldn't what they do in their own region be respected? So, I would say some of the rhetoric we use when it's read there really takes our attention off what the biggest problems are. Well, and when we worked to end the Cold War, the first thing we did was to try to define what our common interests are, and then to put the differences in perspective. And if you'd say my advice right now, if we are going to deal with this, is to find a way, first of all, to get beyond this conflict of personalities, the demonization of the Russian president. he has followed policies that, in my opinion, are not in Russia's interest, are very damaging to Russia's interest. If I were a Russian, I would certainly not be his supporter. But I'm not a Russian. And he does have overwhelming support in Russia, precisely because they perceive him resisting American pressure and NATO pressure, and precisely because they perceive that we don't respect them and we don't respect their right to have interests anywhere in the world. We assert our right to intervene anywhere we wish, whether it's legal or not. We're making a very big deal over their actions in Crimea and in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine, and there's no question. It's in my mind, we should not legally accept the way they acquired Crimea. But looking behind that issue, we should recognize that we too forcibly changed borders without consent in the case of Kosovo and Serbia, and even recognized Kosovo as legally independent. Under the Helsinki Final Act, we and others in Europe had agreed that you can't change borders without mutual agreement. So we were the first to violate that one. And if you speak of invading another country, as the Russians would say, you invaded Iraq. We told you not to. We told you it was going to be a mess. So did your German allies and your French allies. And what was your reaction? You go ahead and do it anyway. And do you think that was a success? And so, you know, when we are saying what they have done in Ukraine is illegal, it is quite true. But they're saying you don't come into the World Court with clean hands on this one. And let's look at some of the reality. Ukraine's problem is it has been deeply divided ever since it was independence between the West on one hand and the East and South on the other. Deeply divided. And as a matter of fact, many of us think that Ukraine is better off without Crimea, because if the Russians in Crimea had not been voting in the elections, their corrupt president that they threw out in the Maidan Revolution would never have been elected. And the fact is that almost certainly the majority of the people in Crimea did prefer to be in Russia. And the Russians would say, don't you believe in the right of self-determination anymore? Okay, the Russians, they did it illegally. And there's no need for us to accept that. But there's also no real practical reason we should be placing sanctions on them. The effect of those sanctions, I would say, is not great. Their economy is going through great difficulties now, but not primarily because of the sanctions, primarily because of the much lower price of oil. That had been their main income. And their success or failure in the future is going to depend much more on the price of oil. When you do economic sanctions in order to achieve a political effect, it is almost always ineffective. And why is that? Well, go back to the Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, and millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. In other words, if they see this as a challenge to them as a nation and as an attempt to put them down, they're going to do whatever sacrifices it will take. And the Russians are quite accustomed to going by sacrifices. But the political effect is the Russian people will say, our problems are not because of Putin's mistakes, which most of them are. They're because the U.S. and the EU is sanctioning us, and because they are hostile, they are putting us down. So actually these sanctions work into Putin's advantage at home. And there are other problems with them. So where do we go from here? I would say, frankly, it's going to be extremely difficult for our current presidents, given the fact they have gotten into this personal give and take for our current president to improve things greatly with Putin. I do think that our Secretary of State is working very hard to settle particularly both the Syrian and the Ukrainian issues, but as far as I can tell, he's not getting tremendous support from the White House. And I would say that such things as President Obama in his State of the Union address, crowing about how we have put Putin's Russia in a difficult economic position, which actually exaggerated the difficulties there. I thought that was totally out of the place in a presidential speech. And then recently, we just had such things as an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury speaking of Putin as corrupt, and then a White House spokesman saying, well, yes, that's our opinion too. Okay, so he's corrupt. Of course he is. How many other leaders are? How often did we talk about Berlusconi or many others in the world being corrupt? I mean, this is a problem for the Russians. In a sense, when you get into that thing, it again conveys to Putin that our only goal is to get rid of him. In other words, to try to undermine his own regime. So again, the attitude is just as if we had under domestic communists later. It's not very helpful. However, having said that, what would it take? Well, first of all, it would take some gestures that would convince Putin that we're not really out to get him, and that's not our aim. And it really means rethinking what are our common interests. The most important one, let's go back to this nuclear issue. And as I said, Russia still has a nuclear arsenal that can wipe us and a lot of others out if it's ever used. And yet, in this development of tensions between the two, almost all of our cooperative efforts have gone by the wayside, including the whole non-Lugar program on nuclear safety. Partly because in some cases, Congress refused to fund some of the aspects, and in other cases, because the Russians closed them down, because in an atmosphere of hostility and collision that we have developed, they are unwilling now for the sort of cooperation that we had for about 20 years in keeping nuclear weapons under control. Now, what are the implications of this? Neither of us want proliferation, and yet under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the nuclear weapons powers were obligated to continue to reduce their nuclear weapons stock as part of their contribution to the non-proliferation elsewhere. And I must say, the whole problem of proliferation dealing with it has stalled now. Clearly, India and Pakistan are not cooperating, and if people worried about Iran going nuclear, I think we have solved that one. I'm much more worried about Pakistan. That is a country which has a history of actually spreading its nuclear capacity, which still is supporting terrorists and the Taliban. They have a growing nuclear arsenal, and who knows, how secure it is. So, there are problems out there that we're simply ignoring in what seems to be, a squabble over, over the geographical and political subordination of parts of Ukraine. That's so. I think we do need to find a way to get back to more cooperation with Russia on nuclear proliferation. Now, unfortunately, when President Obama, I think one of his achievements was the New START agreement, but to get that ratified in the Senate, he had to agree to a very extensive modernization program, which means now the Russians are going through a multi-billion-dollar modernization program. Why? Why? We ended the Cold War first on the basis of an agreement that Reagan and Gorbachev made in their first meeting, which was a nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought, which means there can be no war between us. And it was that agreement that we ended our direct military confrontations. We talked to each side, and why are we building all these arms? Of course we're not going to have a war. And yet the reaction now is, oh, we've got to put more troops in Eastern Europe. President Obama even has in his budget, which the Senate apparently won't even have hearings on, several $1 billion to build up our forces in Eastern Europe, which, by the way, will contradict an agreement NATO has with Russia, because in the 90s, under the Russian-NATO agreement, we agreed not to have permanent bases in Eastern Europe. Now we say, well, there won't be permanent bases, we'll just rotate people in and out. What's the difference? I mean, as the Russians would say, what's the difference? Now, what's their reaction going to be? If we don't watch it, they're going to break out of the INF Treaty. And then what are we going to do? You think we achieve anything by also starting to make these nuclear weapons again? No, it just has no rationality. We need to get back to that. Syria, quite honestly, the Russian position on Syria was a much more rational one than ours. From the beginning of that, they were saying what you need to do is to get all of the parties together and get them to agree on a regime and which will eventually result in an election, which might end with Assad winning or not, probably not. But you don't start by saying Assad has to go before anything happens. And they were saying, that doesn't make any sense. Didn't you learn anything by taking out Saddam Hussein and then taking out Gaddafi? Each time you've ended up with something worse. You want that in Syria? Syria is awfully close to us. And I'll tell you one thing, they are much more vulnerable to Islamic terrorism than we are. Look at the map and also look at the nationalities they have. And they have very legitimate interests in Syria, I would say more legitimate than ours. And yet we've been acting as if they have none at all. And if they don't go along with us, they're a problem. Actually, right now, I think, despite the perception in a lot of our media, I really think Secretary Kerry is trying to work that one out. Because, in fact, we have more interest in cooperating with Russia and Iran than we do in cooperating with Turkey and Saudi Arabia, who actually have created much of the problem there. So this is one of the issues that I think in this case, if we can, we should be able rationally to get a more cooperative policy out of Russia. And in doing it, but it's going to require some change in our attitude. In the case of Ukraine, here again, I think that there is a way out. One thing would be a recognition by, maybe it has to be Chancellor Merkel in Germany. It could be our president, but I don't think our current president will do it, is simply to say, look, let's go back to square one. Let's recognize that Ukraine can never be a successful country without good relations with Russia. Let's tell the Ukrainians, look, you have really got to make a deal with Russia. We'll help you get the best you can, but it's got to be a deal, and you must go into a federated system the way they do. It makes no sense to have the sort of centralized government they have. And, of course, their legislature is resisting that change in their constitution. So The word to Russia must be that let's go back to square one and negotiate a way that Russia and Ukraine can interact economically with the EU to gradually improve the economy of all of them. But part of that has to be that NATO will not consider a Ukrainian or a Georgian membership. That is an absolute red line, which Russia has been signaling now for more than 10 years. And why we can't give that assurance, because the reaction, if we don't give that assurance, then we're not going to get any settlement there, because Russia will not allow the United States to come in and gain control of its principal naval base on the Black Sea, which is in Crimea. I'm convinced that without the perceived threat of NATO expansion into Ukraine, Putin would never have even taken Crimea. Now that they have, we don't have to recognize it legally, but again, we need to put it on the back burner and advise both sides. Look, if the Ukrainians and the Russians will agree that in 3 years, 5 years, some fairly short period of time, there will be another referendum, and that both sides will abide by them, I think that is a legal way out, and that's what we should be advising. Simply beating up on the Russians and sanctioning them is not going to bring any good result. Now, so basically, we need an effort to go back to where our interests lie and convey this openly and then privately about what sort of deals we can do. In the final analysis, 50 years from now, it is not going to make one difference to the world whether Crimea is in Russia or Ukraine, or even whether Ukraine is a single state, or maybe two or three. It's important to the people there what happens to their lives, but not to the rest of us. What happens on the nuclear front? What happens with global warming? What happens in dealing with organized crime? All of these international issues, that is going to be vital in 50 years. And to get distracted by these disputes over, you might say, control of territory, I think has been a great problem and is actually a threat, because in the final analysis, whoever the leader of Russia is either going to be part of the problem or part of the solution to the big questions that face us. And I think we need to find a policy to make them part of the solution. Thank you very much. Yes.
I wonder if you could just say one word. What are Russia's relationship with China? How are they handling that?
Russia's relationship with China. They're handling that very well. Of course, in fact, increasingly, there has been a movement to try to create with China, India, Brazil, the so-called BRIC nations, a sort of an economic organization that would, to some degree, compete with the one that the United States dominates. Now, so their relations with China are very good, but the problem is that now that the Chinese economy is slowing down, and particularly that energy prices are down, China had just a couple of years ago signed a very large agreement to supply natural gas from Russia. Whether there will be the capital to do this at current prices remains to be seen. And they have plans which may or may not be financed, given China's economic difficulties, for new routes of what they call the New Silk Road, with both land and other routes tying China through Central Asia into Europe and through Russia. So definitely there has been a tendency in Russia to try to use the relationship with China to find some alternatives, particularly economic alternatives. But basically the Chinese have played this brilliantly. I think they have gotten, they haven't put a lot of money in it. They haven't recognized Russia's take in Crimea, but they haven't beat up on them about it. And they just go ahead and do their business and are doing it very successfully. Actually, I think good relations between Russia and China are in our interests. I don't look at that as competitive. Good heavens, we don't gain anything if there's tension between them. So I don't see this as threatening to the United States, but certainly the more difficulty Russia has in dealing with us gives them more incentive to try to find common cause on as many issues as they can with the Chinese. And I'd say the same is true with India, Brazil, and some of the other larger developing countries.
It seems to me that often the president of each country is boxed in by right-wing nationalists in that president's country, and that force dictates often our relations with Russia and Russia's relationship with the U.S. If we're to move in the direction you're recommending, how do our presidents in each country handle the right-wing nationalism?
That is a very good question and a very difficult one, and I don't think there's a simple answer. You really have to look at each of the disputes. It's one of the reasons we're hearing now we need to build up our presence in Eastern Europe because Russia might attack the Baltic states. I don't think there is the faintest prospect of Russia attacking the Baltic states. Why would they? The Russians in Estonia don't want to be in Russia or they would have gone to Russia. They're better off in Estonia. And yes, they have some grievances because the Estonians haven't given them the full rights of citizenship. But I think that's going to be worked out. That doesn't mean, and why would Russia start taking up this territory? Now, Eastern Ukraine, each of these situations, I would say, is sui generis in the sense that they have unique aspects. In the case of Georgia, one says, well, the Russian war against Georgia. What Russia did to Georgia was exactly what we did to Serbia over Kosovo, because Georgia had gone through toward its enclaves the same way the Serbs had, except when it was Serbia against Kosovo, we took Kosovo's side. When it was Georgia against the South Ossetians and the Abkhazians, we took the Georgian side. So something else the Russians haven't noticed. But the fact was that Georgia had started that war earlier. They were already going against South Ossetia while the Soviet Union was still there. And that's why George Herbert Walker Bush, when he spoke in Ukraine, August 1st, 1991, advising the Ukrainians and the other non-Baltic republics to stay with Gorbachev in a voluntary union treaty. He warned against suicidal nationalism. He was thinking about Georgia then. And he also said, don't confuse independence with freedom. Choose freedom. And in fact, of course, that didn't happen. And most of the republics, aside from the three Baltic republics, ended up less free after the Soviet Union broke up than it was in the last year of the Soviet Union. You know, when one looks at these details, and in the case of Russia, what Putin is saying is the breakup of the Soviet Union, which although we had nothing, we were trying to help Gorbachev keep the Soviet Union together as a voluntary federation. That failed, but given all the rhetoric about winning the Cold War and so on, most Russians assumed that we broke up the Soviet Union. And therefore, that this has all been a conspiracy against Russia. And the point Putin makes when he said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century, then what he had in mind, he has said since, is because it left so many Russians outside their country. After all, there were Russians in all of the other republics of the Soviet Union. And Russia would say, look, everybody has had the right of self-determination except Russians. Look at Crimea. They never asked Crimea, do you want to be part of Ukraine or do you want to be part of Russia? They just said that's where the border is. And those borders had been set, most of them, back in the 20s by Stalin precisely to divide people so they could be dominated by Moscow. So, you know, when you delve into the history of many of these issues, there is a lot of ambiguity. And yes, Putin has certainly been utilizing this feeling that the Russians have been the put-upon nationality in Europe, been put down. They cooperated to end the Cold War. They virtually destroyed their military might, and then they were treated as defeated and with no rights whatsoever. Therefore, what do? We better build our military back up. We better start pushing back. That's just the way they see it. Now, you know, their military actions in the Baltic and so on, I think, are utterly stupid. But the fact is, I don't think they're doing anything that NATO hasn't been doing all along, which is flying surveillance around the borders. We do it with China. We've done it with them. We just continued a lot of those Cold War things. And I think, you know, I think they're unnecessary for our security, and they're bringing this blowback, which is not good for Russia or for us. Yeah, but, you know, I'm certainly not a partisan of Donald Trump for president, but I think that what he said actually lies behind it precisely what we need to get along with him. As a matter of fact, as I've said to several people, I hate to say it, but on one issue, that is dealing with Russia, Trump is probably better than any of the other candidates now. The only other one, you know, was the senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul. He's out of the race now. In effect, he said, you know, he's a successful leader of his country. Have a little respect for him. And again, he's the sort of guy that you know, you go to him in private and say, okay, Vlad, what's the deal? You know, I'm not going to interfere in Ukraine. Why the hell should I? Now let's get together on Syria. And by the way, we got to give more attention to these nuclear weapons, or else we're going to have a lot of non-proliferation. Now let's get these agreements going back. That would work, I think, with Vladimir Putin. But it, you know, a president who is constantly putting him down publicly is not, you know, is not going to. In fact, he's going to even make him stronger at home, which is precisely what, you know, a lot of the Obama criticism has done.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.